Welcome back to Bettrmma, the best ASMR on MMA YouTube. We are hitting you guys with every single fight that needs to be made after the conclusion of UFC 300. So we'll get right into this, starting with the main event. Alex Pereira, after getting a first round finish against Jamal Hill and defending his light heavyweight belt, he has a little bit of negotiation room here with the UFC and a little bit of leeway in terms of convincing the UFC to make a fight that maybe isn't in Pereira's best matchup, but can be the biggest super fight for the UFC and for Pereira right now. That fight would be fighting Tom Aspinall in 21 days at UFC 301. If he is able to convince the UFC and to convince Tom Aspinall with a nice enough paycheck to fight him at UFC 301, that would triple to quadruple the size and the hype behind that UFC 301 pay-per-view card, given the fact that Pantoja versus Urseg is the current set main event. If we're able to have a super fight between our light heavyweight and heavyweight champion, that obviously exponentially multiplies the excitement behind UFC 301. It seems like he's pretty set on it, but I would prefer him to fight Yuri Prochazka. I think Yuri Prochazka has earned his title shot after their first fight ended in what I would consider was a controversial stoppage. Yuri Prochazka was still moving. He was not limp on the ground. As we know, Yuri has incredible recovery ability. If there's one thing that we've seen in him in his Dominic Reyes fight and Glover Teixeira fight, he has incredible recovery. Being that it was a title fight and he's known to be a life or death type of fighter, Mark Goddard should have gave him his opportunity to take a warrior's way out and fight through everything that Alex was giving him. I would hope that Dana and the UFC speak to Alex Pereira and say, just wait a little longer and wait for Yuri Prochazka, because it was so easy to market and build up that fight between Alex and Yuri before. I think the UFC knows how marketable that fight is. They will do their best to build Alex Pereira versus Yuri Prochazka too. As for Jamal Hill, it's very simple. He's got to fight Alexander Rakic next. They both got finished and suffered concussions, so they're going to come back and fight at a similar time anyways, and that will be a good test to see where Jamal Hill is against the high-level cookie-cutter fighters of the light heavyweight division. Is he going to get out-wrestled and out-grappled, or is he going to show why his kickboxing is an edge above the Alexander Rakic's of the light heavyweight division? If he eventually fights Rakic, Ankalaev, and Jan Blachowicz, those three fights will really put into perspective for us how high level Jamal Hill's striking actually is. I have to admit that I overrated his striking going into the Alex Pereira fight. Next up is the BMF Blessed Man Forever champion, Max Holloway. I think he's got to go and try and reclaim his belt at 145 pounds. Max Holloway versus Ilia Topuria is the perfect fight, not only for pay-per-view's sake and building the biggest fight at 145, but Ilia Topuria needs to have his first title defense to be a legacy-building fight. After knocking out the greatest featherweight of all time, by many people's regard, Max Holloway is in that top three of greatest featherweights of all time. And if Ilia is able to get a win over Volkanovski and a win over Max Holloway, that puts him in the ideal position to build a legacy that contends for being the greatest featherweight of all time. So I think it gives the highest stakes for a UFC title fight at 145. As for Justin Gaethje, he's going to take at least a year off. He's essentially been on a fight-a-year schedule for quite some time now. After facing such a big knockout loss, Justin Gaethje is going to take at least 12 months, most likely 16, and I think a perfect comeback fight will be Dustin Poirier. After Dustin Poirier gets submitted within the first 1 or 2 rounds against Islam Makhachev, he is also going to take another year-long break, and they will come back to have a trilogy. the lightweight division has passed on Dustin Poirier and Justin Gaethje doesn't mean that they have become any less entertaining as fighters, but the matchups for them in the top 10 become less and less favorable for them as time goes on. Dustin Poirier and Justin Gaethje are soon going to find themselves having to fight the lightweights that are coming outside of the top 10 trying to move in. Next up would be Arman Tsarukyan. Arman Tsarukyan has obviously got to fight for the title. He beat Charles Oliveira, the #1 contender. Oliveira gave him everything that he got, and Arman proved that he is championship contender worthy. Deserves the inevitable winner of Islam versus Dustin, that being Islam Makhachev. Arman Tsarukyan had the most competitive fight with Islam outside of Volkanovski, especially in the grappling exchanges. I look forward to see how Arman Tsarukyan can deal with Islam's grappling now, and if he is able to mix in some of his nasty clinch strikes, which he used so well against Beneil Dariush, and if he can catch Islam off guard and upset Islam Makhachev. If Charles Oliveira decides to not take a substantial amount of time off, if he wants to get back into the title shot conversation, a perfect fight for him would be Mateusz Gamrot. Mateusz is looking to get that top 5 matchup to propel him into title conversation, and if we're doing the same favor for Arman Tsarukyan, we might as well do it for the guy who has a decision win on paper against Arman Tsarukyan. Next up is Bo Nickal. Now, I would really like to see Bo Nickal being put up against a known veteran fighter of the middleweight division. And we all know who the test is if you want to be taken seriously for a shot at the top 15. You gotta give him GM3. I really hope they give him Gerald Meerschaert. He is a tough veteran fighter. If not GM3, I would hope they could go in a direction like a Brad Tavares. What I'm sensing they would do is most likely give Bo Nickal either Jacob Malkoun or Andre Petroski. I think Malkoun is a bit less refined than Andre Petroski, and he officially has a win over Petroski, so I think it's an easy matchup to give Bo Nickal, so you can try and build up Bo Nickal a little bit more before you give him that legitimate veteran test like Tavares or Meerschaert. As for Cody Brundage, I say we give him somebody like AJ Dobson, somebody who's coming off the Contender Series, because that was his role in the middleweight division before this, which was just a bottom feeder gatekeeper. As for Yuri and Alexander Rakic, as I said, Yuri should wait to fight for the title. He should recover from his injuries. He's obviously not going to be fighting at UFC 301. Alexander Rakic just got knocked out. He's going to need to take some time off, recalibrate, and he'll come back against Jamal Hill. As for Aljamain Sterling and Calvin Kattar, I think the perfect matchup for Aljamain Sterling at this point would be Brian Ortega. Brian Ortega coming off of his miraculous finish against Yair Rodriguez. We need to see Ortega up against another contender at 45 before we can really take him seriously for another title shot. Those guys should be set up to fight while Ilia Topuria defends against Max Holloway. As for Calvin Kattar, here going 2 routes, either trying to bounce back very quickly with a win, and in that case, I would like to see him matched up against somebody like Lerone Murphy, because I know they're trying to bring Lerone Murphy into the rankings and build up his name because he has the UK fan base behind him. Or more realistically, he should fight the other disappointment on this card, which was Sodiq Yusuff on an upcoming pay-per-view. Now, as for Sodiq Yusuff, if he's not matched up with Calvin Kattar, then I think a great matchup would be Josh Emmett. Yes, it would be the UFC giving him a favor. Sodiq Yusuff has proved that he's not a UFC champion level fighter, but the UFC loves to give fighters a puncher's chance, and Sodiq certainly has a puncher's chance in a matchup against Josh Emmett, and it makes for very exciting must-see TV. So that could be a great addition to a pay-per-view card in the future. If not somebody like Emmett, let's give Sodiq somebody who is trying to be built up into the rankings right now. Maybe somebody like a Joe Anderson Brito, who I think would have a great chance at either submitting or finishing Sodiq Yusuff, or give them the man, the myth, the legend, Nate the Train Landwehr, who will outwork, outpace, survive all the big shots of Sadiq Yusuf, and end up finishing him in the closing out of the rounds. As for Money Moicano, he needs to be moved up into the rankings because his fighting style isn't doing him any good against these lower ranked opponents because he's always forcing it into a grappling fest. So he's got to prove if he's got the capabilities of doing this against higher level fighters. I think a perfect matchup would be Beneil Dariush because Beneil will love to play that game on the ground with Renato, and we will get to see who is the more dominant grappler of the two, who is the more dangerous MMA fighter. If not Beneil Dariush, I think Renato Moicano would be an amazing comeback fight for Benoit Saint-Denis. Now, Benoit Saint-Denis, as we know, is a very wild, dangerous striker. Will Renato be able to take Benoit down? Could very well be a feature fight or a co-main event to UFC Paris whenever Cyril Gane is headlining UFC Paris next. As for Jalen Turner, he should fight Ignacio Bahamondes. I was speaking in my recap video when Ignacio Bahamondes got his KO victory over Christos Giagos that the next real test for Ignacio Bahamondes needs to be up against another long, lanky striker at the lightweight division. And I think it's time that Jalen Turner stops getting these opportunities up the rankings and he starts to prove if he really does deserve to be in the top 15. So let's give Ignacio Bahamondes, the young, hungry, up-and-coming striker, a chance against Jalen Turner. Bobby Green versus Jim Miller. Now, this fight went exactly how I expected it to. Green already made his shot, and there's already beef behind it. I think him versus Paddy Pimblett would be a perfect fight. You know, Bobby Green shows up to fight, and he shows up to put on a show for the fans. Paddy Pimblett needs somebody to build his name off of, and if there's anything that we could take away from this Bobby Green-Jim Miller fight is that Bobby Green does have a fragile chin, and the shots that Jim Miller was hitting Bobby Green with, those were shots that Bobby Green would be able to take in the prime of his career. It's very clear that the Drew Dober knockout, and I'm sure the effects of the Jalen Turner stoppage have taken a toll on his chin and on his brain, and that chin is not holding up as well as it used to. If Paddy is able to run Bobby Green into a head kick, chin to chin, there's no faith I have in Bobby Green being able to eat those big shots, or even if it's a wild leaping hook of Paddy Pimblett with no technique and defensive awareness behind it. One of those wild shots could hit Bobby Green hard enough to where his chin just gives up on him. As for Jim Miller, let's just keep him doing what he was doing before he fought Bobby Green and before he took his other most recent loss against Alexander Hernandez. Give him these guys who are making their UFC debut and coming off the Contender Series. Jim Miller is the perfect test for them. He's good everywhere. He's not exceptional in the stand-up, but he can knock you out. So Jim Miller is a dangerous fight for anybody entering in the UFC. Now, as for Davison Figueiredo, he was ranked number 8 before he took this fight with Cody Garbrandt. I think a great fight would be Davison Figueiredo versus Peter Yan. Now, Peter Yan also needs a fight to really get his momentum going. Both exciting, dangerous strikers. Both were champion at the same time, if I'm not mistaken. So this could have been a super fight at one point. So that's the fight I would make next. I'm very excited for that fight. Whoever wins between Figueiredo and Peter Yan could be the B-side to a title eliminator bout in the future. As for Cody Garbrandt, this is very interesting because Cody Garbrandt gets paid former champion money, so they need to selectively put him on pay-per-views, and they need to choose very wisely where they put him on the card because they are going to be paying Cody Garbrandt a lot, so they want to get the most out of their investment. I think a good matchup and an entertaining matchup for Cody Garbrandt would be Adrian Yanez. Adrian Yanez has faced a couple of losses in the UFC. he really needs to bounce back and start gaining some momentum if he's going to be a force in the UFC. Cody Garbrandt is an established name, and they're going to strike and box with each other. I think Cody Garbrandt versus Adrian Yanez is good. What I think would be a great fight would be Cody Garbrandt versus Peyton Talbot. Now, Peyton Talbot is very interesting because he's a young, raw prospect who shows interesting skills and abilities when it comes to his flashes of talent on the feet and in his wrestling and in his submission attempts. Now, we saw Cody Garbrandt deal very well with a high-level fighter in Davison Figueiredo. How dangerous is the grappling or the striking of Peyton Talbot? I think Cody Garbrandt would be a very entertaining fight stylistically because it's very much the old school of bantamweight fighting against the new school. Cody Garbrandt isn't outside of the top 10 solely because of his chin not holding up, but he's outside of the top 10 because he has stylistic deficiencies against the new breed of bantamweight. I hope you guys enjoyed these matchups. Like, comment, subscribe, do your thing. I appreciate it. This is Bettrmma, the best ASMR on MMA YouTube. Peace.